Hello all and welcome to this webinar on user management, permissions, and a little bit of impersonation. Just a quick call to hear if you can hear what I say. Perfect. Okay, let's get started on the agenda for today. First, a brief introduction to the background for... Oh, just one moment. I have a problem with my speaker. Give me a second. Sorry. Okay, let's try it again. Let me know if you have a problem with the sound. I can see my speaker keeps disconnecting. Okay, the agenda for today. First, a brief introduction to why we have made the changes that you're going to see in this one, in this webinar. Then we're going to dig into user and group types, a new concept introduced in 9.4 that was released almost a year ago. Then we'll look at how we can define various concepts using the user and group types. And we'll also take a look at the new permission system that was introduced in 9.4 also and improved in 9.5. And giving you some insights on how we can use that and also use it together with user and group types to create a role-based permission model. And in the end, we'll take a short look at impersonation, which also is part of course, user management. And you'll just ask questions in the question pane if you have anything that you need an answer on during my speak. So first of all, the introduction, we had a sounding board last year at the summit here in Aarhus, and we talked about how users and permissions should be handled in Dynamicweb. Yeah, as you might hear, the speaker has artificial intelligence or something like that, so it's talking all the time. Sorry. Yeah, continue on. We had a discussion around the user management and the permission system in Dynamicweb. And some of the conclusions are that user management is used for other than just users. And we have a long range of fields to keep addresses and user profile information and coordinates and a lot of custom fields and a lot of them. And all of these custom fields and regular fields are found in one big list on the user itself, on the group itself. And that made it pretty difficult for users to use user management for some of the things that it was used for. So we also added offices and companies and accounts and stuff like that into user management. Depending on what you were using it for, it was different fields that you need to fill out, and that was really difficult for our customers to understand. Another thing that we talked about was how permissions worked in Dynamicweb. And there are a number of issues. First of all, they were working slightly different around the system. So e-commerce permissions does not work the same way as content permission. And another thing was they are not granular enough. We could not lock down enough parts of the administration to a level that made sense. And some people also thought that our permission system was turned around, meaning that when you added permissions on something, everyone else lost their permission, and instead of adding some default permission, stuff like that. So, and there's no fallback to system roles, which also made it difficult to set up a permission system. So all of these things were discussed with you, the partners, and a number of customers that are facing these issues, and are the basis for the changes that we made for the release of 9.4. So let's take a look at the first concept, which is the user and group types. We'll take a look at what they are, what the difference is between a group and a user type, what is the data model, and also how to set up these user and group types. So user and group types, it's basically a way to help organize these different kinds of users and all the information that we need to put on them. And everything, the things that we have in the user management system is everything that can log in, of course, or regular users with a username and password. Then we have things with addresses. That could also be a user, but it could also be an account or a company or an employee or dealers and all kinds of other information that we use not for logging into the backend or the front end, but for displaying on maps or searching or displaying in lists or accounts that are used for impersonation and a long variety of different stuff. And then we also have some grouping of all of these. So we have Danish customers and English customers, and we have logins and roles and all kinds of other things that are grouped in the user management. So, and user and group types is a way to define each of these different types of users and groups and give them a specific look and feel, and only have the fields that we need in order to create a dealer, for example. So we don't need a username and a password on a dealer, so those are fields that we can take out. And there's a number of examples of these different user and group types. So instead of just creating this one type called user, we can now create, as I told you, define the fields that are available for each of these types, give them the icon and a color that makes it easy for us to see with just in the UI what type of information we are on, what type of user and group we are dealing with. And we can also define some rules saying what kind of users can be created and what types of groups and so on. And we have the same opportunities with the groups. I'll get back to demonstration in just a minute. A bit note about the data model. It's the same database that we have been using for many years. So the table is called access user, and we have all the default fields in that one. It's also where you have store custom fields that are created in the control panel. Fields are just added as columns in this. It's all just added as columns in this table as well. And groups and users are all in this access user table. Groups are using, there are users of a specific type, and they're using the access user parent ID to create a tree structure. And users are related to groups using this field called access user groups. So first, this is a screen dump of how we set up a user type. And you can find it in settings under the control panel under users. We have something called user and group types. And we have a question or a comment. And the question is if it's possible to add a custom user property or field that can be filled in at the register step, but also available when they are logged in. Yes, that is possible, and I can show it in a minute how you would do that. So when you're setting up a user group, you give it a name and a description, and you define if it should be a user or group. A group is basically shown in the tree, whereas users are shown inside a group. That's the only difference between the two. Then you give it an icon and a color that can be used to give a visual difference between the various user groups and types. And then you set up some restrictions where in the tree can these things be created. I'll show you an example in a minute, and then in the end of this definition of a user type, you specify which fields should be available and which should be read-only and which should not be shown at all. So pretty simple to set up all of these user types in the system. So I now have 4 examples of different concepts using the user groups and user types for various scenarios that will be typical in many solutions. So take a look at what to keep in the user management and discuss these concepts and set up a structure that we can use for some of these information, setups. So first, what to keep in user management. We have different user types as an example. That could be regular users or something that we call logins. And logins and users are very similar. but in some solutions they're used in a different way. A login will be someone who logs in but is actually going to impersonate another user or another account or stuff like that. So they're basically not directly used. But it could also be stores. If I have a retail chain, it could be all the stores in that one. It could be companies. In our situation as Dynamicweb, we have our partners and our customers in the user management system. It could be accounts, which is someone who cannot log in. It could be a company that has a number of logins that can impersonate one account and make orders based on their pricing scheme, stuff like that. We can have sales reps that can log in and place orders on behalf of their customers, and we have deals and a long other range of things that basically has an address or user login information. In the group types, of course, we have regular groups, so we also have folders to organize all the stores and companies and accounts. We can have companies, like we also have in the user types, where we have all the users for a company in a group called of type company, and we can have it for accounts and roles and so on. So first user story, define a problem. We need people to log into the backend of Dynamicweb and manage only relevant content. And we have different types of editors that need a different set of permissions. And the solution to do to this is define a role-based permission system. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to define a role as a group type, and then I'm defining some logins that can be put into these roles, and then I'm going to use the roles to set up some permissions later on in this presentation. So let's take a look at the structure that I want to create. First of all, I want to create a group called roles, and inside that one I have the various roles called editors, product managers, and administrators. And inside these groups I have my various users, which is the third part of the structure. So let's take a look at a demo of that. I'll switch to the backend of my solution, and I've found the settings section and got into control panel and users, and I found the user and group types. And what I've defined here is I have a role defined in here, and I have a role login, and I have a folder of roles. So first of all, let's take a look at this one. This is basically not doing anything, this role folder. It just has a name, it has an icon defined as a group, and it is limited to only be created in the root of the tree. And then I have almost no fields attached to it. Then I have a role itself. That would be an administrator, the product manager, or Danish editor, whatever it's called. I use this also as a group, and it is allowed to be created in under other roles, and it can also be created under the roles folder that we looked at before. And the fields that we're going to use is something around permissions, the name of the group, and some other minor things that we can use. And the last type I have defined is the login itself, or role login as I've called it, which is of type user. It has an icon, and it can only be created in role folders. And I have a little more information on that. If they're active, can log into the backend, the username and their password, and some names and valid to and from and so on that I would require out of users. So these are three user types and group types that I've defined. And if we're switching to the user management system, we can see I've created a role. That one. You can see that I only have the name and the users that are placed inside it, and I have some permissions that I can set up in the toolbar. So if I right-click this one and say new subgroup, because of the way I defined my my user and group types, I can see I have the possibility of creating a role. And a role would be any of these. I've defined administrators, editors, and so on. So if I take a look at the administrators, it's just a group, and I can see what users are inside this group. And I can also see something called default permissions, which I will get back to when we're dealing with permissions. So, and inside a role, I have a number of users of type role login. So I'll right-click this one and say new user, and I can see I can only choose a role login as a type. So if we take a look at one of the existing ones, It has a username called DK and a password called DK, and it has a name. And that's it. I've removed all the other fields just to keep this simple. And I can also see they're allowed to log into the backend. So this is basically a very simple structure to set up these things and help the editor to create the right structure. So if they click this one and say new, I would have to create a role, and inside the role I can create a user, and it makes it much more easy to understand and set up permissions later on, because we just force a system of icons and colors and fields for the user to set these things up. You could set it up in the same way using regular users and groups, but it's easier to understand with the context of the user and group types. I'm going to show you in a minute how we use these roles to set up permissions for managing the backend as part of the permission part of this webinar. The second user story I have is we have a number of dealers in different regions, and we want to create a dealer search with the region filter and show dealers on a map. And to do that, I want to create a structure of these regions and the dealers, and use the map module to display it. So what I do is I define a dealer folder group type, and I define a region, and I define a dealer user type with some specified fields in it. And I want a structure like this one. So I have some dealers, I have a region, and I have another region, and I have some users. As you can see, it's very similar to roles and roles logins. Now we just use another set of fields. So let's take a look at how that looks. So I have my dealer folder, which is more or less the same as the role folder, just has a different icon and different color and a different name. Apart from that, the settings are exactly the same. The region, same story again, can be placed under the dealer folder. I've set another type and only a small set of fields. And the last part I have is a dealer, which is a, there you go. Has a marker icon, and it is of type user, and it has a lot more fields like the geo. Yeah, right. That my speaker speaking again. So I've added some information about location, names, and addresses and stuff like that. And if we go to user management, we can see like I created a roles folder and now have a dealers folder with regions in it. But icons are very different, and when I click a dealer, a new subgroup, I can create a dealer region and so on. And inside here, I have the different dealers, and the fields that I have available in here are related only to what I need on a dealer: name, address, some location, and so on. So again, it's exactly the same as with roles, just with the right icons and fields that we need for this scenario. Third user story. We have an e-commerce solution that sells B2B to companies with more purchasers, and they all need to log in and buy products using their company prices and discounts. And in order to do this, I'll create a structure of companies and accounts and logins, and we'll use impersonation for the trading part. So we'll define an account group type and an account user type. And we'll define a login that can log into the front end, and we'll use some impersonation to trade as the account. And the structure will look like this. I have a group, and inside that group I have an account folder, and I have some accounts which are users, and then I have a logins folder, which is also a group with a number of logins inside them. And then I'll have the logins being able to log in, of course, and impersonate an account. So login number 1 can impersonate account number 1. So let's take a look at how that looks in this structure. I have the account management, and I have my accounts up here, and I have Dynamicweb and Dynamicweb Norway as 2 different accounts. And then I have all my logins, which would be in this case just me. And I'm just placed in here. And what I've done is I've set up impersonation. So if I log in as this user, I will be able to impersonate the account Dynamicweb. And that means when using the extranet and the e-commerce solution, I log in as this user, and I will impersonate this account. And this is the account with the customer number we have down here, that will control my prices, my discounts, and stuff like that. And that means I can have a number of logins logging in and trading on behalf of the same account, and I would be able to see that in the customer center and in the order management system itself. So that's a third way of using this structure, by defining these types and organizing them in a way that makes sense for this concept. So I know it starts to get boring and I'm saying the same thing, but the last user story, this is also to inspire and give you ideas of the thoughts behind the model we created. The last problem, we have a number of sales representatives that have to place orders on behalf of their accounts. And that would be if we had some sales guys here in Dynamicweb and we wanted to take an order for one of our partners using our e-commerce solution. That's basically what we can use it for. And we're going to use the structure from user story 3 I just showed you, and then we're going to add some sales rep to that solution and create some accounts that they can impersonate. So first, using group types, I've also created a sales representative, which can be placed under the account folder. And I've also, let me see. Yeah, I have the accounts up here that are part of the process of this one. So in the user management, I've created a sales reps, and in here I have a different icon, and I have our CSO, and he's also just a user with a username and a password. The only difference between this guy and this guy is basically their types and their icons, making it easier to see the difference and also help editors to create them the right place. And he's also using Impersonate to impersonate the Dynamicweb account, or it could be one of the logins and place orders based on that one. So is it possible to add custom user property fields that can be filled at the register step, as we talked about? And yes, that is also possible. Might not be super related to this one, but in user management, we have custom fields for users in the control panel. And here I can create the name, system name, and a type of fields and put it into this one. And if I create some custom field and I've typed text just, and I'll save this one. Now I've created this one. And if I define a user and a type, for example, an account login, and I created the one called some custom field, I will see it shows up down here, and I can add it to my user push, and we can go, I think it was a login I did it for myself. Now I have this field available in here as well. And when I'm setting up the user management, let me see. I have a create user profile. Yes, I understand. This create account template can be used to collect information about that custom field and add it into to the front end or into the user account like any other field. So it's basically just using this information and changing the what do we have, the create account template to not only have the fields of the username and password in here, but also add the custom field for the custom field I just created, and we are able to collect that. So that is defining the user and group types using all of these different definitions that I just showed you. So let's switch to talk about the permission system itself. First, I'll just explain the permission model, how it works. And then I'm going to use the roles I defined in the user and groups types to set up some permissions that are role-based. Then I'm going to lock down the backend totally so I cannot see anything. And then I'm going to set up some permissions for the front end and tell you how to upgrade from old permissions to new permissions, because this is a new permission system that needs to be enabled before it works. So first of all, we have 6 levels of permissions. And they're prioritized in this order. So we have none, read, edit, create, delete, and all. And none, of course, means I cannot do anything. I have no permissions, meaning I cannot see it, I cannot edit, I cannot anything. Then I have read, meaning I'm able to see the information, but I'm not allowed to do anything with it. I cannot change it. And of course, edit is I can change existing information like a page, a paragraph, a product, or whatever. And create means I can also create new ones. And delete, I can delete existing ones. And they're bubbling up. So if I have a delete permission, I'm also able to create, and I'm also able to edit, and I'm also able to read. So that's how it works. If I want delete permissions but not create permissions, that's not possible with this system. And the last one is called all, and that means I can do all read, edit, create, delete, but I can also define permissions, new permissions on a set, on something. That means it's basically an administrative privilege that I have in the all section. And in the screen dump, we see an example of all my websites, and I can see I have none, read, edit, and I can set it up for each of them, what should be the permissions for a given group or role or user or whatever. So, and then the system also has a number of built-in roles that you cannot get rid of. And we have anonymous users in the front end, and that would be someone who's not logged in. And that's a regular visitor on my website, and that's a built-in role I can use to set permissions. That means I can take a paragraph and say that anonymous users will see the information, or they will not see the information, and do the opposite with a logged-in user. Then I have authenticated users for the front end, which is anyone who's logged in. And no matter what their group is or their permissions or whatever, anyone who's authenticated in the front end. And then I have authenticated roles or authenticated users for the backend. So if they're logged into the backend, that is built in as well. And then we have administrators, meaning I can do whatever I want as the built-in roles. So these will always be available, and this is where I inherit my information from, or my permissions from. And setting up the permissions, there are two ways of doing that. I can right-click any permission or any object in the system, like page or shop or website, paragraphs or areas or whatever, and right-click them and choose permissions, and that's what you see on the left. And then I can set up permissions for that specific object type. I can see all the groups and all the permissions that has been set up and their inheritance. Another model, which is the screen dump number 2, is going into user management, right-click a group, and take a look at the permissions, and I can set up all the permissions for the high-level parts of the system. So areas are the buttons that we have on the left in Dynamicweb, and we have for websites and settings and web shops and so on down this list, and I can set up all the permissions for one group in one go. So that's another approach of setting up the permissions, and of course they can be mixed and matched. Then we have permission inheritance. For example, we have a website, and a website can have permissions, and those permissions can be put into pages, and pages is the root of all my page nodes in the page tree, and each of the individual pages can have its own permissions, and then we have a paragraph in the last level. And a lot of things works like this. User and groups would also have a similar permission model, but it is only in 2 levels. In e-commerce, we have shop, groups, and products, and languages, which are some things that we can set permissions on. And I just need to move this one. So what I can do with permissions, also because of shops and languages, is I can have a matrix saying I have access to shop 1, but only in Danish, and shop 2 only in English, and shop 3 I have in Danish and English. I can do that using the permission system and inheritance of all of these things. And then we have one last thing in the permission inheritance. So when I have a group, and that group is group that I'm a member of, and that group does not have any specific permission set anywhere in the system. I can go on the group itself and set a default permission and say what should happen if the group I'm a member of does not have any permissions set. So I can say that the default is I don't have any access at all. That would be choosing none for default permissions, which is the default. Or I could set it to all, meaning if I'm a member of this group, I would have permission to everything in the system, and I can set up new permissions in the system. And you can always see in permission dialogs what is the inheritance. So my editors DK, they have a none default permissions, and my editors US has a create default permission, for example, as one way of setting it up. So let's take a look at how this works. I have my solution, and what I can do is I can right-click, for example, the home button and set up permissions on that one, and I can see there's no explicit permission set at all. But then I can see in the inherited permissions that we have some default setbacks, and these, the marketing, the editors, they have a none permission, and the editors US has a create permission, and so forth. These information comes from the user management itself. So if I find my roles that I have here and say editors DK, I have a default permission of none, and that's the one we see from when I right click this one. Editors DK, none, inheriting from the default permission down here. So what I can do now is I can add and say, let's take a look first. I have an editor here called Danish user, username DK. Now I'll go to another browser because then I don't mix up my logins. And this is the Danish user. I'll just sign out so we can take a look. DK, sign in. As you can see now, I can't do anything. I can't see anything in here. There's nothing available because that's my default permission on this user called editors DK, saying default permission is none. So now I can set it up, say he needs access to the home button. And I'll just add the editors DK. I'll use the roles, editor DK role. Read access to that one. I'll do the same with content. Find the DK editors. And I'll give him a read access to that as well. So now I set permissions on these two areas. I'll go back to this one and update. Now I can see I have access to this. I have access to content, but I don't see any content because I only got access, read access to all of this. So I need to give him access to some websites and some features in the website in order to see anything. So I can do that in two ways. I can go in here and say, I want to give him some page permissions or some website permissions, but I can also go into the user management on the editor role itself, click permissions, and I can see what is his permission. We can see the read access that I gave him for the home and content. And then I can go in and say he has access to the Danish website. He can do whatever he wants on that one. But still no settings, no e-commerce, no nothing. I'll save and close that one, and I'll try to update and check a look at this one. So now I have access to only the Danish website. But if you take a look at this one, I have a number of websites, whereas I can only see one of them. So that's how I can use permissions. And if we take a look at the permissions of a page, I can see I inherit now the editor's DK, a delete access, meaning I can read, edit, create, and delete all my pages because that was how I set it up in the root of the pages. So clicking in here, I can say the product page, I can add some permissions on that one. I have him down here, editors DK, I inherit the non-permission. I can add him like this and say he can only read but not edit this one. And I'll update this, go to this, and I set that on products and try to edit this one. And you can see I cannot save because of my permissions that I have. So let's take a look at other roles. I have the product managers in here, which is set up, and I set the permissions up for this one. He's a product manager. He has access to PIP. He has some access to e-commerce, where he can do some stuff. Down here we have access to some e-commerce dashboards and orders, and he has access to some different shops in various levels, and some specific languages, not all of it. So if we take a look at his login, I have a PM product manager that we can use to log into the system. We'll sign out with them. This one. And now we can see I have access to e-commerce and PIM, but not the content area, and that's because that's what I defined. If I go take a look at e-commerce, I only have access to the dashboard because that was the only thing that I gave access to, and only 2 of the shops that I have in the solution. If we take a look at how many we have, you can see, no, it was languages I had many of. So let's take a look at the languages. I have all these languages, but in this solution, I only had access to 2 of them. So let's take a look at the warehouses. You can also see the PIM has been locked down. I only have access to some of it. And you can see I only have access to some of the languages that are available in here. So, and I only have read access to this website or this warehouse. So that's why I cannot do anything in this one. So I can use permissions relatively granular. I'll just show you how this warehouse will look in. Yeah, you can see I also have 4 in here and only 2 over here. And I have all the languages available in here. And only a subset because that was what I gave access to for this specific users. So that's basically it. We can right-click a lot of things. I can also set permissions on other groups, meaning who can manage the group. I can set permissions in the content tree on the various paragraphs. I think I have to go into it and click permissions on this one and set the permissions on an actual paragraph and so on. So I can do a lot of things using the permission system and make it much more granular than I could in the old days. And one new thing which has been very requested is this one. Let's take a look at the editor's role. I can say you have access to settings, you have read access, and under settings I can say you can only see system, for example, for the Danish user, and maybe the e-commerce section at all. So I can do like this. I'll just log off because that was the Danish user. So I'm limiting only to see 2 nodes of the settings and not all the rest of the nodes, which has been a huge requirement. So, and we have a question. Is it easy to handle many users, say several thousand? And yes, basically it is, depending on what you do. If you have 2,000 users that all need different permissions, it will be a hell to set it up. But if you organize them into roles or groups or whatever that makes sense, it's not a problem. We have user databases with up to 1 million users in it. And there's a question about what is the best way to test the permissions after setting them. In case you have several users, you cannot just log into their account to check things. Currently, that's the only way you can do it. You have to log in as a user in order to see it and test the permissions. And the way I do it with 2 different browsers is a very simple way to do it. Log in as just create a user in one of the role groups that you can log in with and test his permissions basically with that one. And there's a question if we can see statistics, how many users use this or that page. Are we talking analytics or in the front end? Yeah, Klaus, you can on a page, let's see, tools. You have these information on a page. So you can see the traffic and the performance and page views and keywords and stuff like this. And let's see. Any other questions? No. Great. And I might also add in 9.6, we're getting a new analytics module that will give you better access to statistics on Dynamicweb. So one last thing. Yeah, I have a slide here. I've forgotten all about it. Yeah, combining permissions. What if you have a user that has conflicting permissions? Because you put a user into two different groups, and you set one group to have none permission on a page one, and the other one to have all. And it works like this: that none plus all equals none. So it's the lower one that wins. And if you don't want that, you can't do anything about it. So that's how it works. And in order to enable all of this, if you have a solution of 9.4 newer, you have this checkbox called Use New Permission Model. And when you set this, you will enable all the new permissions, not the user and group types, you have them already. But if you enable new permissions, you will see the new permission model and new way of setting permissions. And there's no conversion from the old permission model, and that goes for able to put yourself in a situation where you can set up the permissions again using this new one. And the reason for this is because they work very differently. So it doesn't make sense to convert them because it's basically they don't convert in the same way. So then last short talk about impersonation. First of all, what it is and the types of impersonation, and setting up some set it up using the defined roles. We already saw that. So impersonation is a front-end only thing, and it's basically I'm logging in with one user and I take over another user. And what should happen when we take over another user? We'll get back to that in a minute. An example of this could be that we have customers that buy stuff in a B2B scenario on my website, and each of the users in that company, they will have their own login. But when they're logging in, they are required to impersonate their company's account. And then they will buy stuff and place all the orders based on that account, and will get the prices, discounts, and so on that account. So that's one example. Another example is this sales representative login that you have sales guys in the field, and all their customers, they have their own login in the front end, in the website as well. So the customer will do some of the orders themselves, but sometimes you drive around, you come visit them, and you are logged into the front end using your sales representative login. And then you can impersonate or take over your client and place orders on their behalf and see their customer center settings and so on. And once you're done, you log out the impersonation and go back to your own user. That's the most common scenario of impersonation. There are different types of impersonation. There's a very simple one where when you log in and impersonate another user, you would still have your own permissions that are on my original logged in user. And I will also get the prices from my own account. But when I place an order, the order will be tagged with my customer number on it. It's not a very common scenario. There's not a lot of our customers that use this setup. And then we have what we call full impersonation. And that means I take over another user completely. I inherit their permissions, I inherit their prices, and everything else. The website will look exactly like they would see it with the same information. The only difference is I can log out of I can stop the impersonation and go back. It's tagged on orders that I impersonated someone else and placed an order on their behalf. Then we have the limited full impersonation. That's a really crappy name, but it's what it is, because I inherit the prices and all the things that I have from the user impersonate, but not permissions. I keep my own permissions. I don't know when you would use this, but it was a feature request and we'll have it. It might be useful in some scenarios. So that's the three different ways of setting up permissions. And as I showed you, it's pretty simple to set up. I create a user, that's an impersonator, and I can create another user that we can impersonate called an impersonatee. And then we set one user to impersonate the other user. And you can also impersonate, instead of setting another user as someone you can impersonate, I can impersonate an entire group of things. That could be all customers in Sweden. They're placed in a group called Swedish customers, and I can set up impersonation to match that group, and I would be able to impersonate any user inside that group. So that's basically it about the impersonation. I showed you how it worked in the backend before, so I'm not going to show that again. And this is what we talked about. We could define some user concept, set up a structure, handle permission, and use impersonation. And there's a question based on the previous question he had. Do you need to set up something to show the custom field, some custom field at the front end? Yes, you have to do something in the front end. Let's take a look at. So the question is, I define in the custom fields, I define this one, and it gets a system name. And in order to fill it out, because the Dynamicweb is based on templates, and the templates need to render this, you need to go into create user profile. We had this one before, and we have this create account template. And the create account template needs a field in here like all the other fields with the access user SCF in order to be filled out. There is a way that you can change the template so it will list all custom fields that you create by adding a loop into it. But it will require some changes to this template in order for you to use the custom field in the create account part of the system. Hope that answers your question. And I don't know if any other of you has other questions, then feel free to answer it or ask them now. Great. I think that's it then. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you find it useful. And apart from that, I'll see you all out there. And there's lots of webinar coming up in the next couple of months. And actually, there's one in 12 minutes on integration that you can attend if you want to. So that's all from now. And you all have a great Christmas if I don't talk to you before that. Bye all.